And now it's time to operate using multiplication and division. Today we're going to be multiplying and dividing integers using our hot and cold cubes. So get your cubes and your appetite ready. First thing we need to talk about are inverses, additive inverses actually. So if we have a number, say 5, and we want the additive inverse, which just means the opposite sign of, it would be -5. So if I had 2 hot cubes and I wanted the additive inverse, what would make that 0? It would be 2 cold cubes. So the additive inverse of +2 is -2. And it works the other way around. If we have a -2 and we take the additive inverse, a -2, we are going to get a +2. It's really important for multiplication that we recognize the negative part as the opposite of. So let's look at the easiest case when we multiply. Let's look at all positive or hot cubes, all of those numbers. So let's look at 2 times 3. Now when we say 2 times 3, we mean 2 groups of 3. So here's our 2 groups of 3. 3 is a positive number, so we put in 3 hot cubes in each group. So we have a total of 6 hot cubes, or +6. Now what happens when we throw a negative into there, when we're doing negative integers? Still we have 2 groups of -3, of 3 cold cubes. So put 3 cold cubes in each group. We have a total of 6 cold cubes, or -6. So because 2 times 3 is -6 and integer multiplication is commutative, we expect -3 times 2 to also be -6. But it's a little tricky here. Notice we have -3 groups of 2. When we have -3 groups, we can't really take -3 groups, so we need to think about -3 as being the opposite. So I'm going to outline my 3 groups in orange to remind me to take the opposite of those 3 groups. That way I'll have -3 groups. So I'll place 2 hot cubes in each of my -3 groups, remembering that the orange tells me I still have to take the opposite. So now I'm going to take the opposite of each of my 3 groups. The opposite of my hot cubes will be cold cubes. As I take the opposite, I'm going to change the orange outline to black. I now have 6 cold cubes, or -6, exactly like 2 times -3. Let's look at an example where both the integers are negative. The -5 indicates I'm going to have -5 groups, which means the opposite of 5 groups. And in each of those 5 groups, I'm going to have -2, or 2 blue cubes. Now remember, the orange boxes indicate that I'm going to have to take the opposite of each of those groups. The opposite of my cold cubes gives me hot cubes. So I have 5 groups of 2 hot cubes, or +10. Now what if we were to do -2 times -4? Okay, so we have -4, right? And we're timesing it by 2, but not just a 2, a -2. So we're going to take the opposite of whatever 2 times -4 is. So 2 times -4, we're going to take 4 cold cubes, because that's our -4, and we're going to take 2 times it, right? Okay, but remember, we're taking -2 times it, so we have to take the opposite. And the opposite of cold is hot. Opposite of negative is positive. So that's a very interesting, because we have -2 times -4, 2 negative numbers, but when we multiply them together, we actually get a positive. We actually get a hot soup. Kind of hungry. Hungry? It's a break time. Let's try 3 times -3. So we're going to take negative 3 3 times. So negative 3, and we're going to take 3 of those. Now note that that first one is not a negative, so we're not going to take the opposite. We're just going to take 3 negative 3s. And then we have a temperature of negative 9. Bon appetit. So let's try negative 2 times 2. So remember the negative in there tells me I'm going to be taking the opposite. So I'm going to take 2, which is positive, and I'm going to take it 2 times. But I'm going to take it the opposite of 2 times. So let's first take it 2 times, and then remember it's negative 2 times that. And so I need to take the opposite. That will give me a negative 4. Let's try another example. Negative 1 times negative 2. So we take negative 2 one time, but not just one time, the opposite of one time. So if we take negative 2, and we're only going to take one of them, but we're going to take the opposite. And so instead of 2 cold, we're going to have 2 hot cubes. Negative 1 times negative 2 is positive 2. Negative 6 divided by 3, or negative 6 divided into 3 groups, or 6 cold cubes into 3 groups. So if we have 6 cold cubes and we want to put them in groups of 3, we have 2 in each group. Since they are cold cubes, the answer is negative 2. Now let's look at negative 10 divided by negative 5. We have negative 10, or 10 cold cubes, and we're putting them into negative 5 groups, or the opposite of 5 groups. So we're going to use the orange again to remember to take the opposite. We have 2 cold cubes in each group. The orange reminds us to take the opposite of these groups. The opposite of cold is hot, so we change the cold cubes to hot cubes. Each group contains 2 hot cubes, or positive 2. 3 divided by negative 1. That's 3 divided into negative 1 group, or the opposite of 1 group. So we have 3 hot cubes, and we put into the opposite of 1 group. So we're going to color that orange again. 1 group of 3 hot cubes. Now we take the opposite, and we get 3 cold cubes, or negative 3. Let's say we have negative 8 divided by 2. So that means we have negative 8 cubes. Let's go ahead and start with that. 2, 4, 6, 8. So we have negative 8, and we want to divide them into 2 groups. Okay, so you go here, and we can see that they're groups of 4. We're not dividing them into negative 2 groups, we're dividing them into 2 groups. And so each group, if we take 8 and we divide it by 2, we're going to get negative 4. Well, what if we have negative 6 divided by negative 3? So we have negative 6, 6 cold cubes to start, 6 negative cubes. Okay, we've got 6 cubes. Oops, that's 7. 6 cubes to start, divided by a negative 3. Opposite. So we need to take the opposite after we divide it by 3. So if we divide it into 3 separate groups, we can see that there are 2 in each group. So we've got 2 here, but it's not just in 3 groups. It's actually negative. And so we have to take the opposite, and we end up with positive 2. Now this works great because if we were to go back the other way, positive 2 times negative 3 is going to give us, so 2 times negative 3, which means we're taking 2 negative 3s, 2 groups of negative 3s. So let's go ahead and do that. 2 groups of negative 3. There's one group, and there's 2 groups. And voila, we're back to -6. Feels like we undid a whole lot of work, doesn't it?